All right, well, I'm here. This type of let's see how it goes. All right. Hello to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people here. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 16 total in the class?
Online.
16 online, 21 people in total today. What should we do? We should start. What we're going to do. 21 people is, I think, quorum. Or at least half the class anyway, I think. So I think we can start. All right, welcome back to everybody. I hope everyone's doing well. I'm going to start with some bureaucratic announcements / explanations. So it was me who was unwell. On Friday, I got super sick and had a very high fever. Went for a rapid antigen test, but that doesn't tell you definitively. It can give you lots of false negatives, especially if the viral load at the time at which the test is taken is not sufficiently sort of, plentiful for the test to identify it. And so I was incredibly unwell, and I had to, as a responsible citizen of this community, which I invite you to be as well, I informed the USF COVID assessment team, who told me rightfully to stay off campus until I could get a PCR test, which is a more definitive test. It takes longer to get, but it also takes longer to schedule. So I was only able to schedule one until Monday. Wouldn't get the result until after class today. So I was going to move stuff off online anyway. And then I was like, all right, well, I moved stuff online. I will just teach the class online, except that I felt absolutely miserable. As of Sunday, when I sent the message to you, or whenever it was I sent the message, and I was like, I'm not sure if I'm going to be well tomorrow, and I don't want to have you sort of, well, I mean, I could expect you to be here and whatever, but I don't want you to be waiting for the class to start, and I haven't started the class because I'm lying in bed shivering with 104-degree temperature, which is what happened. So I said, okay, you know what, I'm not going to have a synchronous class either. I will, in the nobility of my heart, thought, I'm going to load asynchronous lectures. Keith didn't even email me. He's like, where are the asynchronous lectures? I want to read them. I want to see them. But I can tell you, they take forever to put together. It's actually much easier for me to teach in person because I can adjust what I've said, I can correct what I've said, I can restate what I've said. It's very hard to do that online, and I have to create slides and all this other stuff happens, and I thought to myself, I really can't do that. So I'll just chalk it up to a missed class, that the instructor was unwell, and there was no class on that day, which means that we have to do a little bit of catching up, but not too much. But also this means that I had planned to get started on the grading of your papers this weekend. I haven't even looked to see, so I'm thinking of extending the deadline even further. Anyone not turn the paper in, go ahead, turn it in. I haven't started looking at them. I'm not going to do that. So if you were looking for any news about your papers, I have none to give because I have not looked at them at all. Those are my bureaucratic announcements. Any questions from you about anything at all, online or in person? Sama?
Could you restate the rules for the journal entries? Because I was a little confused last class when you were explaining the few days.
Okay, so moving forward, it's going to be written. It's going to be all of them will be written, and there will be a page in length, one paragraph summarizing an idea or a concept from the reading, explaining it as you best understand it, and one paragraph thinking of how it connects to something in the world. Let it not be a trivial example. Let it have some more resonance, but it doesn't have to be something elaborate either. Mercedes and Maria.
I just wanted to clarify if in the second paragraph, if you don't connect it to a specific event, but you connect it to a modern practice, is
Sure,
that
that's
okay?
fine. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, something that sort of is not just you sort of. I mean, I think the first part is important to actually do the work of understanding what the text is saying, do the interpretive work of restating as the author perhaps would like to be understood what it is that they're saying. But the second part is thinking imaginatively about how this connects to something in the world. Real, like a conceptual thing or a practice or an event. Mario.
I had a question about the way that it's set up in Canvas. So, like the readings for Monday, we can't do a journal for the rest of the semester on the reading that was for Monday. The Buddhism, inner dignity, and absolute
Right.
Buddhism. Can't do it.
Yeah.
So they close, when do they close?
Basically, I set it up so on the day that the reading is listed on the syllabus, it'll close at midnight of that day.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes.
I have
Who speaks?
Marcos.
Okay, Marcos.
I have two questions actually. One of my questions was when is our midterm, and my second question is when are all those journals due that you assigned over the weekend? They still say no due date.
Well, okay. So first of all, there is no midterm per se because there's going to be a second essay. I think. What does it say on the syllabus? And the second essay is due. Anybody have it?
October 22nd,
October 22nd.
like that week.
That week is when the second paper is due. Right. So I'll soon have to turn in a midterm grade, Marcos, and the midterm grade will be basically your grade on the first paper. That'll be your midterm grade. The midterm grade doesn't actually determine anything in terms of how your final grade will be, any more than the fact that it is now, I think, 30% of your grade. So, as to the second part of your question, I'm not sure I understand.
So I'm looking at it now, journal, the ones from last week, those are both closed.
Yes.
No, there's one that's like, hang on, I have it up here on my computer.
I know the Buddhism one was due yesterday. Or
Right,
Monday, sorry.
That one's journal 3, yeah, that's closed.
They also have.
Oh, never. I see a due date now.
Don't have dates, you just close and close.
Yeah.
Close and that's it.
So, and if you heard that, Marcos, so as Mario and Mercedes pointed out and Sama pointed out, they have no due date, but the day and time on which they close is effectively the due date for them.
Got it. Thank you.
If you want to submit for that reading, you don't have to submit it for every week. You don't have to, you only need two more before the second paper is due. So you can choose anything between now and October, what was it, Kirtana?
October 20th.
20th. Between now and October 20th, you could any of the readings you could choose to do it then. Steven, do you understand? Steven says, so the journals say no due date, but they're actually due the day the reading is listed in the syllabus? No. Again, no, I understand the confusion. You can choose which reading you want to respond to. You only have to respond to two of them before the second essay, and two more before the final essay. So we don't want to dictate for you which readings appeal to you, which readings you want to respond to. You have that choice. The idea is to make that option available to you. Not everyone will submit something for the assignment for today. Not everybody will submit something for the assignment on Monday. Some people might, some people may not. We wanted to give everybody who wanted to the option for whichever week they wanted to do it in. That was the idea. Does that make sense, Stephen?
Yes, but also I had a question about the journal that's due tonight for more Buddhism, mindfulness, and transformative politics.
Uh-huh.
Is that a reading that you sent us, or is that one of the readings that we needed to get?
I think I sent it. I posted it online.
That one was due Monday.
One was due on Monday. We will cover that. We're running a little behind, so I'll cover that.
Available until September 29th.
I'm sorry?
It says available until September 29th.
Yeah. Which is tonight.
So we still have time to do it tonight.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Any further questions? These are great questions. It's confusing. It's so much easier to do this like in person, but.
I'll write an announcement with all the.
All right, Shomik will write an announcement clarifying these things. Again, first of all, don't worry about it. Unless you do a phenomenally irrelevant. I don't know. If it's If your answer is completely unrelated to whatever the reading was, like chances are you will get full credit for this assignment. It's a pass-fail assignment. All right.
Could you leave 4 assignments open and just have 2 of them due before the next essay and then 2 for the next one? Because I want to be able to write about mindfulness, but I can't necessarily do it in the frame. You know what I mean? Like I want to, the class, like, is it because you don't want us to use the ideas that we talk about in class? Or is that okay?
You can use them. So, but my point is for you to engage the readings, not the lectures. I want you to engage, of course, but that'll also be part of your essay writing. I want you to engage the readings on your own terms, unfiltered through whatever my thing is.
So you want to do before we have the actual?
Yes,
Okay.
that's fine. Ariana?
I'm not sure if I'm understanding correctly. So is there a journal entry due tonight?
If you want to, yes. If you want to. Does that make sense? No, I think that's where I'm losing people.
Wait, so these journals aren't mandatory for your grade?
No, dude, no. No, they are. You're supposed to do 6 journal entries over the course of the semester. Right? We're on that one? We agreed on that. Because of my mistake, I didn't ask the question early enough. We had to play around with which medium we were going to use to submit them. We settled that for the first essay. Before the first essay, we got 2 out of the way. So that's done. Now, we have the rest of the semester. You're supposed to do 4 more journal entries. 2 before your second paper and 2 after your second paper, but before your final paper. Now, between now and your second paper, there are at least how many sessions?
6 or 8.
6 sessions? Maybe 8 sessions between now and when the second paper is due. I don't care which reading you choose to write about, so long as you write about any 2 of them before the second essay. Similarly, before the final essay, there'll be, I don't know, another 8 sessions. I don't care which readings you choose to write about, so long as you write about at least 2. The way we have set up the assignments is we do not know which ones you will choose to write about. In case you choose to write about something, we want to make it available to you. Nicholas says, I'm so confused. Is everybody confused about this?
I'm
No.
confused. I understand, but I'm confused as to why the reading closes the day we're going to talk about the reading. Because what if, like, the day, like, when leading up to the essay, I want to write about Buddhism, mindfulness, and transformative politics, but I can't because we finished the class on that.
Because I want people to keep up with the readings as well. I want to keep that option open. Of course, you can figure out what you think about Buddhism after the fact of thinking through my lecture and thinking through what you thought about it since. Subsequently, use that for your paper. But I want you to write these journal entries on your own terms. Approach them as you would on your own terms, unmediated by me. Okay, I'm getting lots of messages. So Stephen says, just to clarify so I understand correctly, the journals close the night of the lecture on that reading listed on the syllabus. The syllabus for reading passes, we don't write on that reading. We would have to choose another reading and date for one of the journals. Yes, because each of the assignments in Canvas is titled the specific topics. Yes. Taylor says journals 2 to 10 are open for you to pick from. You used to do 6 this whole semester. In fact, Taylor, now they only have to do 4. Brooke says you have to pick 2 journals out of the 8 to do before October 20th. Perfect. So where is the more reading? I can't find it. The more reading is under the files tab, right? That's where I put it. So if you go to the files tab, Marcus, you'll find there's a reading by Moore. Steven says, I'm just confused with if you write on any topics, why would the assignment, this is Maria's question. This is collaboration. So Steven says, asks Maria's question, if I'm just confused because if you could write on any topics, why would the assignments close the day of that reading's lecture? Again, the idea is I want you to write it before, ideally, you have a chance to, listen to my lecture. Ideally, but I can't stop it. It would be very awkward for Shomik to set up an assignment that stops exactly at 12:30 before class starts, and you can't do it before. It was an inelegant solution, would have required far too much work from Shomik to manually change the time for each assignment. But the idea is for you to try to engage this stuff on your own. Make your own sense of it. Bring it with you to class. Bring it with you to discussions. Bring it with you to our conversations. Yeah.
But why is journal 3 locked?
It's due Monday.
Yeah.
So like the one for today is gonna close tonight.
Yeah. Journal 4 and 5 and 6 and so on and so forth. I'm sorry, I understand you. I'm sorry. I hope I'm being frustrated with myself that I'm not managing to explain it in a clear enough way. That this is what the purpose behind this was. Maybe in the future iterations, I won't do the journals at all. I don't know. They seem to work well when there are a lot more people in class, in person. They seem to provoke discussion because people have read. And so maybe this is an artifact of an age when we could assume lots of people could be in classrooms, but we can't do that anymore. And so maybe I need to change that assignment as well. All right, if there any further questions about some?
Not a question, but I think people are just mostly confused because like the first couple weeks we kind of forgot about.
Yeah, no, and that's on me. I dropped the ball on that completely.
So it's not about like, you're explaining it pretty well. I think it's just because it was absent for the first couple of weeks, which is
Well,
fine.
you're very kind, but maybe I am not. Maybe I'm explaining well, Sama, but maybe I'm not as well. It's entirely possible. So I apologize for the lack of clarity on my score. Hopefully, if you have any further questions, please do not hesitate to email me. We need to get to the business at hand. The board today is not going to be particularly helpful because I didn't get a chance to finish writing, so I wrote Buddhism. So let me reconstruct for you what I'm going to try and talk about today without the help necessarily too much of what's on the board. But it will require us to do a bit of a recap because it's been some time since we talked about Hobbes together. And so just allow me to go back into Hobbes momentarily. But before I do that, let me tell you what I'm trying to do. So, and I think I've already given a hint of that somewhat along the way. So Hobbes, as I've said to you before, creates an argument for why we need the sovereign state, the Leviathan, that has been very influential in explaining and justifying state authority. We live in a world that Hobbes built. I mean, Hobbes, for his part, would say that he was just describing certain basic characteristics of life, but we think, or states think in terms that are Hobbesian. And the best way for me to explain that is by turning to IR, simply because international relations people do such a horrible job of IR, mangle him so thoroughly, that it actually makes it easy for me to explain him. But what I want to do, though, because Maria raised this great point last time. Maria said, just to remind you, she said, sure, Hobbes may be right insofar as state is the solution to problems, but let us not forget that the problems that the state purports to solve are created by the state itself. Was that your point, Maria? Right. Now, that was a great point. What I want to show is that for Hobbes, there's another way of interpreting Hobbes, another angle into Hobbes that leads to a different problem. Because the way that the IR people have created the problem of Hobbes, the way I described it to you in a way on last Wednesday, is that Hobbes is offering us a solution to the problem of fear of violent death. I'll say more about that again in a moment, just to remind you and bring you all up to speed again. But this other way of going into Hobbes argues that what Hobbes is offering a solution to is not the fear of violent death, but the fear of our dignity being violated. That the whole story starts because people are touchy about their dignity. And from that, it creates a whole sort of cascade of outcomes that end up in the state. And so it's dignity and the conception of the self that's behind it that causes all of this stuff to happen. What is the alternative to it? And so my intuition that I'm trying to work through with you guys is that maybe Buddhism, which has a different conception of the self and a different conception of dignity, might offer us a different way of thinking about the problem of fear, the problem of sovereignty, problem of human nature, that does not necessarily lead us into Hobbesian arms, or into Hobbes's open, welcoming arms. So that's my intuition that I want to try and work through with you guys. What would the world look like if human beings were understood differently, if their motivations were understood differently. Now, the way I want to do it is by reconstructing for you the Hobbes story. Right? So the Hobbes story, according to international relations people who spend a lot of time talking about Hobbes, there are various reasons for why human beings need a state, why we end up with a state. One of the arguments is that human beings are operating in a world of scarce resources. So this part I'm happy with, not over here. They're operating with scarce resources. And with scarce resources, it just so happens, or states are operating with scarce resources, and when your resources are scarce, you're fighting for the same set of opportunities that you need to survive, you are inevitably drawn into conflict. There's something about the very fact that we are finite beings that need other things to survive, and those other things themselves are in short supply, that leads us into battle with each other. That's the IR version of why Hobbes says we end up in a state of war. And if we end up in a state of war, this is where the IR people don't actually get into it very much. If we get into a state of war, we end up in a situation where we are reduced back into the state of nature. And in the state of nature, as I mentioned to you last time, life is solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Because everybody is afraid of everybody else and what's going to happen to them. Nobody can be secure in what they have built. Nobody wants to build anything. Nobody wants to do anything. There's no commerce. There's no art. There is no cinema. Nothing. We're just reduced into beings who are only, sort of concerned with their own well-being. And in that situation, we end up in this absurd realization, profound realization of the absurd situation we are in, where we're all capable of killing each other and doing nothing else besides. And so we all drop our weapons at the same time, and we agree to a covenant that will give everybody, the equal protection of the Leviathan against each other. That's one story. Another IR story about how Hobbes' world works is, this is what's called structural realism. It says it doesn't matter what your personal motivations are, or what a state's personal motivations are. The fact that you're living in an anarchic world, a world of anarchy, which means that there is no authority in place, means effectively that you will be drawn into conflict. Because you cannot be sure of somebody else's motivations. You would be foolish to not act in a way that protects you, at the very least, from the worst outcomes of somebody else's possible malintentions against you. Right? So in the international realm, you're a state that's a democratic state and wants to be nice to the world and hug and sing and dance with everybody else in the world. But you have a neighbor who could, if they wanted to, cut off your access to a river that provides drinking water to the vast majority of the population. Now you could hope that your neighbor is also populated by people who are loving and kind and nice and happy, and that they will, of course, never cut off the water that your people so desperately need, but you cannot be sure. And because there's no real authority out there, the UN is a toothless debating society, because there's no real authority out there that you can appeal to, you would be foolish to not take measures of some sort that ensure that your people are able to get water. It's not about individual intentions. It's not about necessarily scarce resources. Of course, that is also part of the story here. It has to do with the structural reality, the very structure in which you find yourself, a structure that preceded you, a structure that will outlive you, that dictates the course of action that you must take. And if you read Hobbes from that perspective, then you still end up in the same place. You realize, if you live in the state of nature where there is nobody around to appeal to enforce the law, you realize you need an authority that will enforce the law, that will prevent you from being killed by somebody else. And that is why you agree to the Leviathan. You end up with the state. You say, hey, Leviathan, the state, sovereign power, please come and protect me. Create a police, create a judicial system, create something that'll protect me from my neighbor who would otherwise potentially kill me, or I would kill them. So that's another realist story. A third realist story is that human beings are just bad. Human beings are naturally bad. They have a desire to dominate everything around them. They are unable to dominate everything around them because somebody else equally powerful, or maybe even more powerful than them, wants to dominate them. And that fear of what will happen to them if they're dominated by somebody else leads them to take the first step, to unleash the first strike, and that cascades outwards into a melee that engulfs the entire world, and now we're left again in the state of nature, nasty, poor, brutish, mean, and short. Where our lives are nasty, poor, brutish, mean, and short. And again, we appeal to the Leviathan to come and tell us, please, stop me from being fearful of this person who wants to dominate me, protect him or her from being dominated by me, and let there be peace. So the realists have constructed the story of how Hobbes, starting with either scarce resources or just the structural nature of the state of nature or just human nature, will lead to the need for a Leviathan. Does that make sense so far?
When you say appeals to the need for Leviathan, you mean that appeals to the society that you create, right?
Yes. So appeal. So yeah. I mean, yeah. I'm using. Yes. Thank you for clarifying the question, or asking me to clarify that point. Yes, to create a state, and then say to that state, come and make sure that we are all living under the same law, that the law applies to all of us equally. Because effectively what you're doing when you create a Leviathan is you're saying, I myself am no longer responsible for my own defense. The state is responsible for my defense. That is the state's sole authority. And in the discharge of that authority, the state can do pretty much anything it wants to. Because that's the single most important thing that a state must do. Now, in the context within which Hobbes was writing this, and we talked about this last time, the English Civil War, while to us today it may seem like too much power is being given to the state, Hobbes may have said that that still is not enough. The state needs even more power, because the alternative is an English Civil War, or a civil war, where people are fighting each other for all sorts of reasons, over all sorts of things, and in a way that leaves the earth charred and people's lives destroyed. Much better to have a Leviathan, a state that will prevent those sorts of conflicts, act as a mediator between people's conflicts, than to live in a world of anarchy, Mercedes.
Well, if this theory is true, and that's what realists argue, that in this state of anarchy in the international system, people would want to have a Leviathan, then I guess the argument would be that after all this time, why is there no Leviathan, and what are the different reasons as to why no one could agree to what a Leviathan should be?
I think that's to my mind, that's why people in IR are not readers of Hobbes. They are users of Hobbes. They don't actually understand or care to understand Hobbes beyond a certain point. It helps them explain something about the world, but that's all they need to explain. But if you were to follow the Hobbesian story, you would end up with a Leviathan, which in the international realm hasn't happened. Because the realists will say things haven't gotten bad enough. When they do, people will need. I mean, like, one of the arguments that has been made, and now with the U.S. government releasing its own evidence, partial evidence of the existence of UFOs, maybe not so outlandish anymore, but it would take the existence of maybe aliens landing on Earth, a superior power, more dangerous that our immediate enemy poses to us for everybody to come together. The realists might make that argument. But they're not readers of Hobbes per se at that point. See another hand?
I was gonna ask you to also, you mentioned, I don't know if you said, Hebesian story?
Hobbesian.
Story?
Yeah.
You reference that a lot, but I missed what.
Oh, no, Hobbes.
What is it?
Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes.
It's Hobbes, so it's Hobbesian. It's like,
I have no idea what you're talking about.
The Marian story, the Mercedian story.
So like the story he's telling in.
Yes,
what he wants.
yes.
Okay.
Or a story that we would, if you were to use his logic, would sort of how it would play out. So that's, kind of what we talked about last time. Now, the reason why human beings are the way they are is because Hobbes has a very materialist understanding of what human beings are like. Again, the wonderful lines with which he begins bear repeating every time one reads them. For what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels giving motion to the whole body, such as was intended by the artificer. Human being, the human body, is the product of a series of causes and effects that are immutable, that are inescapable. And so he, in his mind, is simply tracing out the consequences of what happens when you start with some basic features of what human beings are like and play them out. And one of the fundamental things, which again I want to talk about because it brings us back here, one of the fundamental things about human beings is that human beings are constrained in how clearly they can perceive reality. All reality must be channeled through their, the instruments by which they interact with the environment around them, and those instruments are fundamentally flawed. And so their understanding of the world is fundamentally flawed. Now, I say all that because I want to tell a different Hobbesian story. And I don't want to go too far deep into sort of the nitty-gritty of it, but I do want to talk a little bit about this. So this different Hobbesian story says, look, sure, all of this stuff is true as far as it goes, but Hobbes himself is making a much more complex psychological argument about what human beings are like. And that argument is interesting to me for my own research purposes, for my own, it sounds like I'm like so this is a laboratory, it's not. But it's interesting to me for the kind of research that I want to do. And it goes something like this. The Hobbesian story, this other Hobbesian story is that what motivates people ultimately to actually fight is not worry about scarce resources, though that is certainly somewhere in this, it's undeniable that Hobbes talks about it. It's not just the structural nature of the fact that, you're just in a position where you must act, or because if you don't, your enemy could act against you. But that is also something that Hobbes kind of says. And it's not just that human beings are bad by nature, anxious to dominate others. Though again, that is something that Hobbes also says. What actually motivates people to fight is when they feel that when they feel slighted, when they feel they've been insulted. Because the thing that's the most flawed about human beings, that human beings imagine themselves to be the center of their own universe. And they want and desire from everybody around them diffidence, is the word he uses. Acknowledgement of their greatness. No matter how petty the person you see in the world, petty in their social life, they're also petty in the way that we would understand it, that they want and are offended by the absence of recognition of their greatness. And it is the slighting of or the presumed slighting of our dignity that Hobbes, in his own moment in time, when he's writing about the English Civil War, he says that is the cause of conflict. That leads us down a path of irremediable destruction. I just want to find a quote here, but for my purposes, what's interesting about this story, as opposed to these other ones, is that it tells us a much more complex sort of gives us a much more complex account of what actually causes people to fight. He says this in chapter 13, page, for my purpose, I was in chapter 13. On page 88, he says, "Every man looketh that his companion should value him, at the same rate he sets upon himself, and upon all signs of contempt or undervaluing, naturally endeavors, as far as he dares, to extort a greater value from his contemners, from his people who have condemned him or held him in contempt." And his basic idea is, if I slight you, that causes you a tremendous pain. A pain that leads you to act out against the person who has held you feel, in some sort of contempt. You may not actually be able to do it. You may not actually be able to act out, but you want to. But in moments when you can act out, that is the source of conflict. Which means then that it's not fear or the fear of untimely death that is the thing that motivates conflict, but instead it is the purpose of the state to teach you through the awesome power that the state has of how much more afraid you should be of death than of having your honor being besmirched. So the purpose of the state becomes then not to necessarily end conflict, but to teach you that the price of conflict is your death. Now, what I was hoping that you guys in person and also online could help me understand this. Does this sound true to you? That contempt can be the cause, or a sense of dignity that you have about who you are, can be the cause for conflict? Alex? Alex, I'm sorry. Andrew, why am I saying Alex? Andrew.
No, I was about to say, I mean, that sounds like true to me. I'm not sure I could see it as the start of every conflict, but I mean, I feel like that's kind of true. I mean, you even see it on certain national and international levels, because the whole concept of national prestige and all that.
So. Oh yeah. I mean, I think President Trump's whole shtick was, they're laughing at us, folks. They're laughing at us. I mean, he would say that very frequently. They, being the international community, is laughing at America. So yeah, so there's in the international realm as well. Sama, the Mercedes?
We could see conflict arise in the case of religious or national identity. So if that is disrespected or challenged, there can be conflict that arises from that.
Yeah, but even then, okay, so okay, all right. So at first I thought you were going to go in a different direction with that. Wait, hold on, religious conflict is not the same as the conflict caused by contempt. But you're saying it can be also. Can you explore that for me? What does that look like? When someone insults your religion, why is that?
So since religious identity and ethnic or national identity comprises parts of you, it's what makes up your identity. If that is disrespected or contempted, it can be a source of conflict.
Okay.
Because we're not separated from those beliefs.
Okay.
Am I making sense?
No, you are. No. I'm trying to think through things along with you. Okay. Keitha?
I wanted to quickly add to what she was saying. I think.
Who's she?
To Sama.
Okay.
But I think also when you're saying religious views, I think it's also the way of living. So when people are, when you're saying that someone's way of living, because for some people that is religion, then that's also being attacked. So it's your whole existence sort of, because it's your beliefs that are being attacked. So in that case, like I can see like
Okay,
what she's saying. That's all I wanted to know.
Mercedes?
I don't necessarily disagree that having, I feel like another way to describe what he's saying is just having pride.
Sure, okay, let's do
So,
pride, yeah.
But I wouldn't necessarily disagree that pride causes conflict and can be a cause of conflict, but I disagree with then the argument that the state's responsibility to, like, ultimately, to achieve peace is to teach people to fear death more than they should fear their pride being hurt. Because I would argue that fearing death is also a cause for conflict. And that in itself is not going to remediate conflict from existence.
Sure, okay, so I think, okay, so let's look at the word pride instead of dignity. Let's look at, or what would you recommend the word pride in place of? What was it a substitute for?
Yeah, I would say that it's, in the way that he describes it, he makes it sound as if we have less of like the dignity of the right of existence and more about the pride, and he means is that we have a perception of ourselves, and if someone challenges our perception of ourselves, that in itself will cause conflict. And I feel a better way for, at least for me to understand that, is through pride rather than dignity, because I feel like dignity, at least now in the context of how I understand it versus how Hobbes said it, just because of the way that things have happened, that dignity is seen more of a human right to exist. And I consider that what he's saying to be more like pride, but I'm not necessarily saying that it's the same thing.
Sure. Yeah, so there's some debate. Okay, fine. So there's a debate about what dignity actually means. Lots of huge debate about it. So okay, so we go with the word pride, and you think, okay, there's still a jump from where pride is to fear being inculcating fear being the role of the state. Okay, all right, that's a fair point. Now, I think Matthew wants to say something. Matt wants to say something online, and he can jump in. Ready?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, Matt.
So I'm taking a globalization class, and we're talking about nationhood and global conflict, and I talked about the recent Armenian-Azerbaijan war, and I sort of described it in terms of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, where I said Armenia was Sparta and Athens is Azerbaijan in this case. And I used the example of Armenia had the Armenian genocide, and then later on, Azerbaijan became much more successful and wealthy and more integrated in the global system. And I said this preconceived notion that Armenia had a real or imaginary slight against them because they were doing much better in terms of their global economy than them. That's why they preempted 30 years ago for Nagorno-Karabakh. And my solution to this is once the big players, Putin, Erdogan, and the Iranians came in and said, you all need to stop this or we're all going to like shoot every single one of you because this could get very violent and nasty. State actors need to realize that the cost of war should be, the cost of doing that, the transaction cost needs to be way steeper than any amount of swag you can get. And the part of Nagorno-Karabakh that they're fighting over isn't actually full of resources. It's just historical, quote-unquote, homeland, etc., that both claim is theirs. And so when they have notions of like passion and honor and dignity and your ancestors are watching, people will actually act in ways that don't make any sense because they could have just gotten the UN involved and say, we're going to cut this up, we're going to have like open borders, we're going to be, enlightened about this, but they decided not to because there's that aspect of pride machismo that they have.
Okay, no, okay, that's a good. I mean, again, we're still in the realm of international relations where this thing becomes vivid in a way that it's hard to sort of at the individual level because we're all socialized into being nice people. But yeah, so as Matt pointed out, Azerbaijan and Armenia had a war recently over strategically and a piece of land that is not worth as much as was made out of it by the people who were fighting for it. And that has to do with the fear of being slighted by the other country if the other country got it, or made claims to it, uncontested claims to it. And that actually led to bloodshed. Have the bigger powers come in and say, we will impose a very serious material and physical cost on you if you continue this conflict. And that sort of greater fear of being destroyed forced these two countries to step away from what was otherwise a very bloody conflict about matters related to dignity. Christopher, do you want to jump in as well? Right, okay, that's a great point, Chris. And that's kind of that's why people like Hobbes are more easily absorbed sometimes into the international realm sort of descriptions than in the ones that they were operating in, which was the concept of domestic society. So the reason why the IR appropriation of Hobbes works is because of anarchy, the lack of any single authority to enforce its rules, whereas we, as you said, living under constituted authorities, constitutional governments. The question where it becomes interesting, why Rawls hits the ground for us, is when should we obey the state, and why we should obey the state. When you ask that question, then you can get a very Hobbesian answer. You should obey the state because otherwise the state will destroy you. And that's how it ought to be. Because to go off on your own and figuring out on your own what you think your conception of right and wrong is vastly destabilizing to the peace that a state brings. And so that we must rely on the state for our defense against each other. And that defense is not against each other over scarce resources or over structural conditions, but the fact that left to their own devices, people will end up killing each other over trifles. Now, Mark, I'll come to you in 1 second. Now I realize Chris and everybody else who may have had the same question or is thinking along the lines that Chris pointed us towards, that this is a very trivial example. But I want to nevertheless point to it simply given its ubiquity in popular culture. I've not watched too much reality television in my life, but my understanding is that for a lot of reality television, conflict is the spice that makes the show run. Right? Am I right on that? And very often, even when there is no structural conflict or conflict over scarce resources, it is about people's perception of themselves. That they feel, someone feels slighted by how they were treated by somebody else, and that becomes the point at which conflict sort of erupts, and then that provides the drama that sustains the reality television. Now, the fact that people watch this means that they recognize it as an element of their own interpersonal relationships in some fashion. Sublimated. In their own lives, they may never treat people the way people treat each other on reality television, but they understand the motivations, otherwise it would make no sense. It would be like a kabuki theater that they could not make heads or tails of. The very fact that we understand how reality television works, why even if someone's reaction is absurd, we understand it as a normal reaction that someone could have, normal, understandable reaction somebody could have, means that we also recognize how our sense of ourselves is bound up in how we're perceived by others. So, for example, I'll bring it down to earth in a way that's very immediate. When you guys were asking me about the journal readings, I was getting frustrated, and I was getting frustrated with myself. But as I was speaking, I realized that there's a very great danger that you may think that I'm getting frustrated with you, or that I am diminishing your concerns. And I got very afraid at that moment. I was like, I don't want them to think that. I don't want them to think that because I don't want them to lose faith in this class. I don't want them to think that because I don't want them to go complain to my supervisor. I don't want to get bad evaluations. All sorts of reasons may have run through my head. But I understood that you could have felt slighted by me. So I had to say something along the lines of, which is true, that this is about my frustration with myself. And if you felt even for a moment that I was slighting you by being brusque or being cavalier in how I was answering the question, then you understand what Hobbes is talking about. Did anybody feel like that when I was giving my answers? Okay, nobody did. Okay. Ooh, I revealed too much of myself.
No, but you're saying, yeah.
Spencer felt like it. Kind of. Oh, okay, all right. We see, here comes the truth. Christopher says kinda. Spencer says yes. Matthew's like, no, I'm all good. Okay. All right, Maria, go ahead.
I was gonna say, no, what you're saying, that does make sense. But I also think that it would have to happen, there's professors, it would have to happen over and over again, where we're assignment and they're just like, okay, we're not gonna explain anymore, just understand, and your confusion, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So that's where you're a little bit more of like an understanding professor, so we can explain it.
Sure, but I can see how power imbalance can also make you feel slighted, right? It's not just about it. The really irritating thing about the situation is that I have more power than you, at least in the short term of grading you. You could go and contest your grade and everything could be settled afterwards.
So like in this metaphor, are you the state?
No, I'm just another person,
Okay.
right? But you, even though I have more structural power than you, I should not have more power than you. I'm not better than you in any way. But you feel that inequality against your skin. And if I play the wrong sequence of things, if I say the wrong sequence of words, I could trigger you pretty seriously. And I understand that. I would understand why you would feel triggered by me. And the fact that we have that capacity within us, under the right sorts of circumstances, can be very injurious to peace. Mercedes.
So then I have a question that
Sure.
if you apply Hobbesian theory to domestic level,
Okay.
in which does this mean that should the Leviathan be the only authority in one's life? Because if the government or Leviathan or whatever larger thing is to have the authority in your life, I mean, realistically speaking, they're not going to be the only authority. I mean, an example of which I can say is like you're going to have the authority of your parents and your family, and then the authority of the state. But if those both exist, then you might find yourself in a situation in which those two things are in conflict with each other. So then my question is that if the Leviathan is the solution to peace, if that's what it's going to be, then does it need to be the only authority? And there can be no others.
Perfect. Now that allows me to segue into this part. Perfect. The short answer to your question is yes. The ultimate authority is the state. Now, the cool thing about Hobbes' world is he says, liberty is greatest when the law is silent. If the Leviathan hasn't said anything to you about how you should conduct your life in matters X, Y, and Z, do whatever you want to do. The Leviathan only speaks about stuff that concerns security. The Leviathan believes that there should be only one religion, and the religion that it approves of, then that's right, according to Hobbes. It's not right because it's morally right or God mandated it. No, it's right because that's the only way we should get security. In fact, the job of the Leviathan, this is what we get into over here, goes even further than that, right? Because if you remember, one of the causes of conflict is that our sense perceptions are wrong. We feel slighted when there was no slight meant, no insult or injury intended. Then it means that our very capacity to understand reality through language is compromised. We give the word dignity when all we meant was vanity. We use conscience where all we meant was our own interest. We find these high-flying words for brute facts about power and how it impinges on us and how it makes us feel. And so one of the things that the Leviathan must do is it must redescribe reality as it actually is by giving new definitions to things, by stripping them away of their nonsensical, high-minded fluff and showing them for what they actually are. Like it's happened to me last time, and this time again it's happening to me. Here's a whole series of ways in which he redescribes things. This is great. This is fantastic. So this is in chapter 10. He says, the value or worth of a man. What is the value or worth of a person, do you think, according to Hobbes? Is of all other things his price. That is to say, so much as would be given for the use of his power, and therefore is not absolute, but a thing dependent on the need and judgment of other. So if someone says, I have immeasurable value, I'm of immense value, my worth is unthinkable. Hobbes would say, oh yeah, how much, what you're basically saying is that it'll cost a lot to get you to do what I want you to do. That's all you're saying. There's nothing high-minded about what you're saying. You're just putting a price, a very high price, on your services. Things like that. the purpose of the Leviathan is to redefine words away from their very highfalutin, imprecise meanings, which can create all kinds of conflict, to a very steady, stream of things. Now, I want to go to Buddhism now, and I'm going to go to Buddhism now. And you will see why, although it sounds utterly absurd in the beginning, hopefully I will draw out some more implications here. There is a connection to what Buddhism does. Now, Buddhism, by the way, the reading that I gave you is related to the question of dignity for the reasons that I've been talking about this entire time. It was also like a very basic, simple, short description of some very basic, simple, short ideas of Buddhism that we're interested in. I could not find a good enough book that I thought would work for us in terms of the political theory of Buddhism. That was also not too involved and too complex. But I can give you a recommendation if you're interested. Buddhism is basically a reform movement within Hinduism. And Buddhists believe that life is a series of causes and effects that are playing out in the life of, or life cycles of each individual entity. You are the karmic product of your own past life choices. Your future life choices will dictate your future states of life. Well, that's certainly that's the Hindu idea of it. The Hindu idea was that there's a self that persists across time, a self that is the same self that is an ant in one life, it's an anteater in the other next life, that is a dolphin in the next life, and it becomes a bird in the following life, and on and on and on. In each life, it adds a little bit to its karmic worth, and goes higher and higher on the plane of existence until finally it is born as a human being. But even that human being then adds more and more actions that either take this human being further along the lines to moksha, which is released from the cycle of life and death, or bring it further back down. Like, a Hitler, for instance, would be reborn as as a cockroach or something. The Buddhists believe that karmic cycles are inevitable. You are repaying the debt of previous actions. But the self that exists, the self that in Hobbes' world, for example, is joints and wheels and springs and hot springs or whatever, that self is an illusion. But there is no self. And what we think of as the self, and what we think of as attachments, worth sustaining and caring for, we might still care for them, but there is no essence behind them. There is no reason why we should care for them because of what they are. They are, like us, a random collection of, not random, but a collection of atoms that have come together and will someday disperse and reassemble in some other form. There is no essence behind why we're here. Now, what that means is that at some level, Buddhism is also about learning to disassociate ourselves from our first immediate reaction to things. Because our first immediate reaction to things is mediated through our sense organs. We understand the world in a certain way because that's the way we've been built to see it. And while there is some value in what we see, that is not sufficient. What we see is not sufficient. Because our attachments, our cravings, are guiding us in interpreting the world in a certain way. And what we should be able to see eventually is the nothingness behind the object that we meet. Now, that doesn't mean that this table isn't here. Of course it's here, right? Hit my hand against it hard enough, my hand will hurt. If I hit it harder, maybe this table will break. The materiality of these things are here. But this materiality doesn't have any larger purpose behind it, in it being here in this way, in this moment. Or to think about it in terms of human emotions. You say to me at the end of the semester, this was the worst class I've ever taken. The professor was all over the place, didn't have any clue about what he was talking about, and the only saving grace of the class was the TA, who was a wonderful help. Now, my first reaction to that will be, oh my goodness, I'm hurt. I'm devastated. Put so much work into this class, blah, 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 blah. Buddhism will say, sure, of course it hurts. Your actions did create the consequence. Something you did inevitably led to the consequence that the class that you thought you were creating was not the class your students were experiencing. There is no escaping that fact. But you do not have to attach to that morally as it's saying something about you. Your dignity does not depend on that. It does not depend on the perception of others. Because you're only seeing a partial reality. You're only able to glimpse one aspect of the truth. But where, for the Hobbesian world, if this whole thing leads to a world of conflict, this plurality of views leads to a whole world of conflict that must be mediated and resolved through the intervention of the state. For the Buddhists, initially anyway, the role of the state is not to intervene. There is no role for the state, in fact, in some forms of Buddhism. What you're interested in, ultimately, is to see the interconnectedness of all beings, of all reality, understand your karmic reality, that you are a being who will suffer. Suffering is a part of life. There is no escaping suffering. And that through meditative practices, through practices of redescribing reality, re-engaging it on a new level, you have the opportunity someday of breaking free of the cycle of life and death and of suffering and achieving nirvana. So your karmic responsibilities are an individual affair. The state has no business in it. So you can actually, in a weird way, you can see why a lot of libertarians end up being Buddhists, because they don't want the state at all. But I'm trying to find passages here that'll help illustrate what I'm trying to say. So just one point. So there are four noble truths in Buddhism. Right? The first states that life is suffering. There's no escaping suffering. That we are impermanent beings. And the second truth, the noble truth of Buddhism, is that the cause of the suffering is a craving, a desire. We want stuff, we don't get that stuff. We feel like our life is suffering. We want relief from pain. Pain that happened to us, let's say we got into a car accident, we had nothing to do with it. We want relief from that pain, we don't get it. We suffer. The third noble truth is that there is a way out of this cycle of life and death, of desiring, craving, disappointment, suffering. And the fourth is that through certain practices, meditative practices, you can actually achieve nirvana. What's your question?
Oh, I was going to ask if you could rephrase the connection that you made between the individual to the state. I feel like it just kind of went over my head.
Sure. Okay, that was too quick. Okay, all right. So we'll explain it and get this maybe a question that I want to throw back to you guys. On one understanding of what Buddhism entails. Buddhism is about your personal salvation. Your personal salvation is the product of conceptualizing your relationship to reality. It's not the role of the state to conceptualize your relationship to authority. Sorry, I'm getting my words are beginning mixed up.
Like state can't get involved in what you individually think? Is that what you're
Your own
saying?
spiritual journey.
Yeah, in the sense that, I mean, the state can try to, but it won't really succeed in it, right? If a state comes in and says to you, you will not crave, or else, I will beat you on the head. Then you're like, well, you're teaching me to crave my own personal safety. So there's no, state has no, external authorities have no way of actually shaping your relationship to reality. You, through certain meditative practices, through some forms of austerity, some forms of sort of, simple living, can try to recreate or reconfigure your relationship to reality. But the state cannot really do that for you. And the state doesn't have any role to play in it. Because your spiritual freedom is going to be your spiritual freedom, nobody else's. So the state, in that sense, has no role to play in it. Like Jesus saves, sure, Caesar doesn't save, right? Mother doesn't save, Obama doesn't save, Biden doesn't save. Right? Your relationship with Jesus Christ, for instance, saves you. In a similar way, for the Buddhists, there is no external authority that's going to come out and save you. You must face the fact of your own existence on your own. Mercedes.
So, what form of Buddhism is this drawn from? Like in history, is it before, like this is before it split into different branches?
I think so. He's talking about one of the earlier forms of it. So not the earliest forms, but I think so. This is, I mean, so on some interpretation, this, he talks about this King Ashoka, who was, I think, with some interpretations, he lived at the same time as if there was a real Buddha, the historical Buddha, or a few generations after him. It was very close to the appearance of a man called, or a movement called Buddhism, but not exactly with it. But it's a very early moment in it.
So are we referencing Buddhism as it is now while it was India before it went to China?
Yes, we are. In this particular context, we are, yes. Because I mean, we need some kind of grounding. There's so many different traditions of Buddhism out there that it's very hard to figure out which one to go
I was
with.
just asking for context.
Sure, no, it makes sense, yes.
I'm gonna, since you mentioned China, I know in China, in their schools and stuff, they have the students, before they start the day, they do some sort of exercise or meditation thing.
Uh-huh.
Wouldn't that sort of be the state enforcing practices? So they are helping the children?
Mara?
I was thinking the exact same thing about, not specifically Buddhism, but just religion. In interplay with the state power of the government. For example, in some Middle Eastern countries where they mandate hijab in certain areas, it's you are asking people to do the performative things regarding a religion and an ideology, but you can never know if, for example, I can speak for Islam, but you'll never know if the woman that wears hijab actually truthfully has submission to God, or even
Sure.
is guided by the religion, or guided by
Right.
followers to
Right, so I think one of the cool things about this form of Buddhism early is that it acknowledges that. And even early forms of Christianity acknowledge that, right? Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, because what really matters is your soul, and that is your own business, which is between you and God, not between you and the state. So, in a similar fashion, the state has no role to play in redefining reality for you. You must go through that process. What the state is trying to do is it's trying to provide a uniform definition for everything. People have different understandings of different concepts, and when they don't have their reality or their version of it realized, they get upset, they get angry, and they come to blows. Whereas with Buddhism, people will have different conceptions. It's inevitable. And they must themselves individually learn to see the flaws in the way they experience the world. Not by creating a uniform experience for everybody, which will somehow be true, because no such thing is possible, but by letting people explore and work out for themselves the implications of how they went wrong in understanding the world when they were looking at it. What this means, however, though, is that we are ending up in very similar places, not with respect to war or the authority, but with the question of reality as the Hobbesian story, or the second Hobbesian story that I told you today. I guess my question, and I'm working through this thing with you guys on this one. How many of you believe that life is all suffering?
That life is what?
Life is suffering. Ron, you have a question, someone?
I don't believe it, and to the extent that Buddhism describes it as, but I think it has some reality in that statement, or weight.
I mean, to kind of go off of Summer's point, it's like I don't believe like life is all suffering, but I do feel there is some accuracy in the sense that suffering is derived from some sort of internal or external desire, craving.
Mercedes?
I don't necessarily disagree with that. It's just that I understand life to be at least existing in two different ways, in which there are your physical sensations, in which you have physical displeasures, but then you also have like emotional displeasures or everything. But it's like just as much as like you can go outside and you can sweat and be hot, there are things that will make you experience things that aren't necessarily connected with the physicality of what's happening. So I think that being alive may produce suffering, but it's not necessarily divorced from experiencing happiness or other things.
I would say that I think I understand the idea that life is struggle and conflict, but I don't think that it's necessarily supposed to be suffering consistently. I don't think that's like, maybe it's the wrong word in my opinion, because I think that, I don't think that's like sustainable for someone's mental state to be constantly suffering when faced with conflict. I think you're supposed to kind of adopt the way that you react to conflict is kind of supposed to change throughout different stages of your life. So it's not constantly supposed to throw you into this pit of suffering or depression.
Yeah. So all the Buddhists are like clinically depressed people? What? There you go. So?
I think when they describe it as suffering, they're just, here, let me work through this.
Sure.
When they describe it as suffering, they're in a sense trying to recognize that your desire of outcomes is what leads you to suffer. And that has so much truth to it. So in terms of grief, when you mourn a person, are you mourning the person or are you mourning the outcomes that that person could have had? So what you expected of that person's life. So it has weight to it when you apply it to the way that you mourn outcomes or people, and it can redefine how you grieve in those situations.
Sure.
So you should separate yourself from desire and outcomes because nothing's going to work out the way you want it to. And you should instead be aware of all realities of the actions you take in order not to grieve those realities.
So thank you, that's perfect. Thank you for saying that. And I especially appreciate for you teaching me to take a moment and say, let me work through that idea, rather than blah, which is what I do. Thank you for that. So let me work through this idea. Let me tell you about Buddhists that I saw one time. There were these guys dressed in very simple robes, and all of them were wearing a face mask. This is well before COVID, so that's not the reason why they were wearing face masks. And they all had a broom with them. And they were all barefoot. And this is how they walked. With the broom, they walked backwards. They were wiping their own footprints away. Why do you think they were doing that?
Yeah.
What are they wearing now?
I don't really know how to phrase it, but I mean, to me, that just seems kind of an exercise and kind of like, I don't know, separating yourself from like the physical effect you have on the world. Like, I don't know if I'm putting that the right way, because if you're literally sweeping away your footsteps, like, you get what I'm saying?
Sure. Is there?
I think maybe like sort of what you were saying, but kind of different, like worldliness. So like maybe they were trying to like with the mask, they're kind of not taking in like the toxins that might be in the environment or like in the area, and like if they're wiping away their foot, then like they're getting rid of the dirt or the sand or whatever that's on their foot that's like on their body. So like sort of like taking themselves out.
All right, okay.
I have a question. Where did you see them?
I think I saw them in India.
Okay. Just like
We're out of time. I can't tell you the answer. I cannot tell you the answer, but I will on Monday. And I think there is, this is the last thought before we leave. All of you are right. Obviously, life is some happiness, life is some suffering. I feel happy right now because I gave you an idea maybe to think about. Wow, please don't go and research because I'll just ruin everything. No, go ahead.